My brother got my college fund because, according to my parents, I didn't really need it. After all, I already had a decent job. They decided it was fair, so I kept my mouth shut and moved out. Fast forward a year, and suddenly, he needed money desperately. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, each vibration rattling against my desk like a nagging reminder. I glanced at the screen. My mother's name lit up, the same woman who had looked me straight in the eye a year ago and said, "You'll be fine, sweetheart. You don't really need the money." I let the call go to voicemail. The past year had been brutal, but I had done exactly what they told me I would. I survived. No safety net. No college fund. No help. And now, out of nowhere, they remembered I existed. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. I wasn't shocked. My brother, Ethan, had never been responsible with money. Actually, calling him irresponsible would have been an understatement. He wasn't just bad with money, he was a financial catastrophe. But for some reason, my parents had always seen him as the golden child, the one who would go places. So when the time came to decide what to do with the college fund our grandparents had left us, there was no real discussion. "It's only fair," my dad had said. Fair. That word still made me laugh. Fair was me working full-time at 17 while Ethan got a brand new car for his birthday. Fair was me scraping together my own money for everything while he got to focus on school where he managed to rack up thousands in debt. Fair was me getting a call one day, out of the blue, being told the savings I had counted on, the money that was supposed to give me a shot at a better life, was gone. "Your brother needs it more than you," my mother had said. "You already have a good job." A good job. At the time, I was pulling 40-hour weeks at a hardware store, barely making rent, struggling to keep the lights on, and squeezing in night classes at the community college. I had spent years carefully laying out plans for my future, only to watch them disappear in an instant. Meanwhile, Ethan had been failing his classes and partying every weekend. But somehow, he was the one who needed the money more. I didn't fight them. I didn't argue. Didn't yell. I just packed my bags, walked out the door, and never looked back. Now, a year later, my phone sat on my desk, buzzing nonstop like an alarm I refused to acknowledge. But I already knew why they were calling. Ethan had screwed up. And, of course, they expected me to clean up the mess. I stretched, grabbed my coffee, and let the phone ring. This time, I didn't owe them a damn thing. The voicemails started piling up. At first, they were casual. "Mom, hey, honey, just checking in. Call me when you get a chance." Then, the tone shifted. "Mom, listen, sweetheart, we really need to talk. It's important." And soon enough, the guilt trip rolled in. "Dad, I don't know what kind of grudge you're holding, but this is serious." "No, please. No, if you can. Just a demand." I needed to call them back. Because, as always, I was expected to be the responsible one. The fallback plan. The safety net. I ignored every single message. It wasn't until day 4 that I got my first real clue about what was going on. I was on my break at work, aimlessly scrolling through social media, when a notification popped up. Ethan tagged in a post. I hesitated for a second, then tapped it. Curiosity won. And there he was, Ethan, lounging at a poker table, drink in hand, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. From the look of it, the casino was high-end, the kind of place where people drop more money in a night than I made in a month. The caption? "Big night, let's make history." The timestamp? 2 weeks ago. I stared at the picture, my grip tightening around my phone. This absolute idiot. I wasn't even shocked. Just irritated. He had burned through my college fund, my future, and then had the audacity to blow even more cash gambling. I kept scrolling. Another post. Then another. Lavish nightclubs. Designer suits. Expensive vacations. And then radio silence. Ethan, who usually posted every little thing he did, had completely vanished from social media. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just in trouble. He was broke. And judging by the way my parents were acting, I had a sinking feeling he owed money to the wrong kind of people. I exhaled sharply and locked my phone. Let them panic. I wasn't going to be their way out this time. By the end of the week, the messages shifted again, this time dripping with desperation. I was home, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when my phone buzzed against the table. Not my mom. Not my dad. Ethan. I let it ring. No way was I answering. Then a voicemail popped up. With a sigh, I hit play, already bracing myself for whatever mess he had dragged himself into. Ethan, look, man, I know we haven't talked, but I really need your help. His voice shook. I'm messed up, okay? He hesitated, then exhaled shakily. It's not just money. It's serious. And if I don't come up with it soon, I'm screwed. I frowned. Ethan had never been the type to sound scared. He was cocky, reckless, always assuming things would work out for him. But now? He was actually afraid. Then came another voicemail. Mom, please, sweetheart, just call us back. We wouldn't be asking if it wasn't life or death. Life or death. I didn't know if she was exaggerating, but something in her voice made me pause. That night, for the first time in over a year, I drove to my parents' house. Not to help. Not to forgive. I just needed to see for myself exactly how bad this had gotten. When I pulled into the driveway, it was eerie how little had changed. The same flickering porch light. The same half-wilted rose bushes lining the yard. And inside? The same family that had once made it painfully clear I came second to Ethan. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, my mother yanked it open, her eyes red and puffy. The second she saw me, her face flooded with relief. Thank God, she whispered. Come in. I stepped inside, and there he was, Ethan. He looked awful. Not just exhausted, completely wrecked. Dark circles clung under his eyes, his hair was a mess, and his leg bounced anxiously as he sat hunched on the couch. My dad stood nearby, arms crossed tight over his chest, radiating tension. Angry. Ethan looked up at me, and for the first time in our entire lives, there wasn't a trace of arrogance on his face. No smug grin. No careless shrug. Just fear. How much do you owe? I asked. The room went silent. Ethan swallowed hard, then said the number. $50,000. The words hit like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a grin, to say he was exaggerating, that this was some dumb misunderstanding. But he wouldn't even look at me. My mother sniffled. It's worse than just the money. Of course it was. It always was. I crossed my arms. Tell me everything. Now. Ethan sucked in a shaky breath. I got in with the wrong people, he mumbled. I thought I could double my money. I just needed to win a few big hands and... I let out a bitter laugh. And let me guess, you didn't. He rubbed his face, looking utterly miserable. It was fine at first, he muttered. I won a couple of times, felt unstoppable. He shook his head. But then I lost. And I lost big. I didn't need him to spell out the rest. I knew exactly what had happened. He had kept playing, chasing his losses, convinced, like always, that luck would magically turn back in his favor. But gambling debts didn't just disappear. And judging by the way my parents were acting, this wasn't just some casino problem. Who exactly do you owe this money to? I asked, my voice tight. Ethan hesitated. My mom squeezed his hand. Sweetheart, just tell him. He swallowed hard. A guy named Marcus. I clenched my jaw. I didn't know Marcus, but I knew his kind. This wasn't a bank loan or some maxed out credit card. This was dangerous. Are they threatening you? I asked. Ethan gave a slow nod. I have a week to pay. My father, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. They came to the house. His voice was tight, his fists clenched. 2 men. They didn't break in, but they made it clear they weren't playing around. I exhaled sharply. This was bad. You need to go to the police. No. Ethan's head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. You don't get it. That'll just make it worse. He stopped, his breathing unsteady. My mother wiped her eyes. We just need the money, sweetheart. That's why we called you. I let out a slow, humorless breath. Of course. Not to check in. Not to ask how I'd been after they'd taken everything from me. They only remembered I existed because they needed something. Again. I shook my head. No. Ethan blinked. What? No, I repeated, my voice cold. I'm not giving you a dime. My mom gasped. But this is different. Is it? I scoffed. Because from where I'm standing, it's exactly the same thing it's always been in this family. You made a choice a year ago, remember? You decided he needed the money more. My dad's jaw tightened. We didn't know this would happen. And I didn't know I'd have to work twice as hard to rebuild my life after you threw me aside. But I did. I turned to Ethan, my voice steady. Figure it out yourself. His face twisted in anger. You're really gonna let me get hurt over this? I stared at him, unblinking. I didn't put you in this situation, I said. You did. I turned and walked toward the door. Mom chased after me. Wait. Please don't go. We'll lose everything. I glanced over my shoulder. That's exactly what you told me a year ago. My voice was quiet but firm. And you didn't care then. Then I walked out. And I didn't look back. I expected the calls to start immediately. Half expected my dad to storm outside, demanding I come back, or for my mom to break down in the doorway, pleading with me to reconsider. But they didn't. They just let me go. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I had expected this. I knew my parents only reached out when they needed something. And Ethan? Ethan had never taken responsibility for anything in his life. But still, some small part of me, the part that remembered being a kid in that house, fighting for scraps of attention, felt the sting of it all. When I got home, I shut off my phone. I wasn't in the mood for guilt-tripping, frantic messages, or whatever excuse they'd come up with next. Let them figure it out. For once, it wasn't my problem. 2 days passed. Then 3. I didn't check my voicemails. I didn't read my texts. I just kept moving forward, the way I always had. Then, on the 4th night, there was a knock at my door. Not a casual knock. Hard. Urgent. I hesitated. I wasn't expecting anyone, and given everything that had been happening, I had a bad feeling. I checked the peephole. Ethan. I let out a sigh, debating whether to ignore him. But before I could decide, he knocked again, louder this time. I unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to see his face. He looked even worse than before. Bloodshot eyes. Hands trembling. His head jerked over his shoulder like he was checking to see if he'd been followed. Please, he said. Just let me in. I didn't move. Why? He swallowed hard. Because they're after me. I stood there, silent, just staring at him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. His leg bounced restlessly, hands clenched into fists. He was terrified. And for the first time, I actually believed him. But that didn't mean I was going to fix this for him. Keeping my hand on the door, I asked, "Who's after you?" He swallowed again. Marcus's guys. A cold weight settled in my stomach. He hesitated. They came to the house again. But this time, they weren't just making threats. My grip on the door tightened. What do you mean? Ethan exhaled sharply. They trashed Dad's car. Slashed the tires, smashed the windows. His words came fast, tumbling out like he was scared to even say them. They left a note on the windshield. Said I had 48 hours left. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. I think they're watching the house now. I couldn't stay there. I arched a brow. So you came here? He nodded, desperate. I didn't know where else to go. I stared at him, my fingers curling around the edge of the door. It was surreal. Just a year ago, Ethan had everything: my college fund, our parents' unconditional support, a life without consequences. And now he was standing here, shaking, begging me for help. If things had been reversed, if I had been the one in trouble last year, would he have helped me? I already knew the answer. I let out a slow breath. What do you want me to do, Ethan? He licked his lips. Just let me stay here. Just for a few nights. Until I figure something out. I didn't answer right away. Letting him in would make this my problem. But shutting the door? That would mean leaving them to deal with it, my parents, Marcus, and whoever else Ethan had dragged into this mess. Ethan must have seen the hesitation on my face because his voice cracked when he spoke next. Please, he whispered. I should have shut the door. I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside. You get one night. He didn't hesitate. He slipped inside, shoulders hunched, breath heavy like he'd just outrun something. Maybe he had. I locked the door behind him and turned. Start talking, I said. Tell me everything. Ethan sank onto my couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles went white. His foot tapped against the floor in an erratic rhythm, his whole body wound tight like a coiled spring. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Talk. He swallowed hard. Marcus isn't just some guy at the casino. His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept or had been doing a lot of panic talking the last few days. He's connected. I frowned. Connected how? Ethan shook his head. Not the kind of guy you call the cops on. A heavy feeling settled in my gut. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear him say it. Are we talking loan sharks, Ethan? He hesitated. Then nodded. I let out a slow, controlled breath. Of course. You really are an idiot. Ethan flinched but didn't argue. So you borrowed money from a loan shark, thinking you'd just win it back? He dragged a hand down his face. I didn't think it would get this bad. At first, it was just a little. His voice dropped to a whisper. And then, he squeezed his eyes shut. I lost. And I kept losing. And they just kept lending. I finished for him. Ethan nodded miserably. It was so easy to get more, and I thought if I just won one big hand, I could walk away clean. I scoffed. Yeah? And when has anything ever been easy for you? He didn't answer. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. Let me guess. You missed payments, the interest skyrocketed, and now Marcus wants his money immediately. Ethan swallowed hard. He said if I don't pay by tomorrow night, they'll make an example out of me. My jaw clenched. This was worse than I thought. Marcus wasn't just threatening anymore. He was setting a deadline. A final warning before things got ugly. And Ethan had come to me because he had nowhere left to run. I stared at him for a long moment. He looked small. Like a kid who'd just realized there was no way out of the mess he'd made. I could feel the weight of a choice pressing down on me. I didn't owe him anything. I didn't owe any of them anything. But if I didn't do something, there was a real chance Ethan wouldn't just be out of money. He'd be hurt. Or worse. I exhaled. I'll help you. Ethan's head snapped up, eyes wide. You. I held up a hand. But not the way you want. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. What does that mean? I grabbed my keys. It means we're going to pay Marcus a visit. Ethan paled. Wait, what? No, you don't understand. I turned to him, my expression cold. Oh, I understand just fine. I stepped closer. You got yourself into this mess. Now we're going to see if we can get you out of it. Without paying a single cent. Ethan opened his mouth to argue. But one look at my face shut him up. Get in the car. Ethan hesitated at the door. This is a bad idea. I grabbed my jacket. You got a better one? He didn't answer. We got into my car, the silence between us thick enough to choke on. Ethan fidgeted with the cuffs of his hoodie, his knee bouncing as I pulled onto the main road. He lasted a few minutes before he finally spoke. What exactly are you planning to do? I kept my eyes on the road. Talk. Ethan let out a sharp, nervous laugh. Yeah, because that always works with guys like Marcus. I didn't respond. Truth was, I had no idea what I was walking into. But one thing was certain, I wasn't handing over a single cent. And Marcus was about to find that out. Ethan slumped lower into the passenger seat, fingers drumming anxiously against his knee. Every so often, he'd glance at me, like he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to. Eventually, he muttered, You really think Marcus is just gonna let this go? I exhaled through my nose. I don't know. But we're gonna find out. Ethan shook his head. You don't get it. These guys don't negotiate. If you don't pay, they make an example out of you. That's how they keep control. I glanced at him. Then why haven't they done it yet? He hesitated. What? I kept my grip steady on the wheel. They've given you multiple warnings, trashed Dad's car, made threats, but they haven't actually touched you. Why? Ethan swallowed hard. Maybe they're just waiting. I shook my head. No. If Marcus thought you were useless, you'd already be paying for it. Ethan's breath quickened. Then what are you saying? I tightened my grip on the wheel. I'm saying they don't want your money, Ethan. I glanced at him. They want something else. He stared at me, his face pale. And I had a bad feeling we were about to find out exactly what that was. The drive felt longer than it was. Ethan didn't say another word, his earlier protests dissolving into quiet dread. I could feel his fear like a weight in the air, pressing down, suffocating. I didn't say anything either. There was nothing left to say. When I pulled up to the address he'd given me, my suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't some seedy back-alley gambling den. This was a business. A sleek, high-end lounge nestled between expensive bars and high-rise restaurants in the heart of downtown. The kind of place where people like Marcus didn't just operate, they owned. Ethan swallowed hard. We don't have to do this. His voice was barely a whisper. I killed the engine and turned to him. Yes, we do. His hands curled into fists, but he didn't argue. I stepped out of the car. Ethan hesitated a second longer before scrambling to follow. Inside, the place was all dark leather, dim lighting, and low music humming beneath the murmur of voices. A few men sat at the bar, laughing over glasses of expensive whiskey. Near the back, a couple of sharply dressed guys looked up as we entered, their eyes sweeping over us like they already knew why we were here. And then, as if he'd been expecting us all along, Marcus appeared. Late 40s. Well-groomed. Wearing a suit so crisp and expensive it practically screamed power. A slow smirk curled at his lips. Ethan, he said smoothly. Like we were just old friends catching up. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Ethan tensed beside me, his body going rigid as Marcus' eyes landed on him. Marcus, Marcus raised a hand, silencing him, and his gaze shifted to me instead. And you are? I stepped forward, keeping my expression neutral. His brother. Marcus arched an eyebrow, intrigued. The responsible one, then. I didn't take the bait. We need to talk. Marcus studied me for a long beat, his expression unreadable, before he gave a small nod and gestured toward a corner booth. Let's talk. Ethan and I sat down across from him. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his posture oozing confidence, like he owned the room. So, I assume you're here to settle your brother's debt? I didn't hesitate. No. Ethan stiffened beside me. Marcus' face remained impassive, but something in the air shifted, like a quiet storm brewing. No, he repeated, his voice low, as though he hadn't heard that word in a long time. I held his gaze. I know how this works. If you wanted Ethan gone, he'd already be in a hospital or worse. But you haven't touched him. I leaned forward, my eyes never leaving his. That tells me one thing. Marcus said nothing, just waiting for me to continue. You don't want his money, I said, slowly, you want something else. Marcus' smirk widened just a fraction. Clever. Ethan looked between us, his confusion evident. Wait, what? Then what do you want? Marcus steepled his fingers, turning his attention back to me. Your brother's an idiot. He glanced at Ethan, who visibly flinched. But he's an idiot who knows people. He's been running his mouth, making connections in places he shouldn't. And now, I have a problem. I stayed silent, watching him, knowing he wasn't finished. Marcus' tone shifted, his smirk fading into something colder. Ethan owes me 50 grand, yes. But more importantly, he owes me trust. I frowned. What do you mean? Marcus tapped his finger against the table, a rhythmic, deliberate sound. A few weeks ago, your brother got involved in something he shouldn't have. Met people, overheard things he shouldn't have. He flicked a brief, almost dismissive look at Ethan. Didn't you? Ethan went pale, a nervous sweat breaking across his forehead. He hesitated. Marcus shook his head, a small, amused smile crossing his lips. He was at the wrong table at the wrong time. But instead of keeping his mouth shut, he ran. And now? Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples like a man with a headache. I have a mess to clean up. I narrowed my eyes. So what do you want? Marcus' smirk returned, colder this time, almost predatory. I want to know what he told. And to who? Ethan's breath hitched, and he stammered, I didn't say anything, I swear. Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with menace. You expect me to believe that? Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. I didn't. I cut in, my voice sharp. If I get you the truth, will you drop the debt? Marcus studied me for a long moment, his gaze calculating. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. Find out who he talked to. And maybe, just maybe, we can reconsider. I exhaled slowly, then stood up. Come on, Ethan. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with confusion. We're leaving? I didn't answer. I simply turned and walked toward the door. Ethan followed, his footsteps hesitant and unsure. Once we were outside, Ethan grabbed my arm, his fingers trembling. What the hell just happened? I stopped and turned to face him, my patience gone. You tell me, Ethan. I said, my voice ice cold. What did you get yourself into? Ethan looked away, his hands shaking uncontrollably. And suddenly, I realized something. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.